when I was thinking about, what folks could best share insights about the what bearing state and federal elections have on credit unions. I've known both these gentlemen for a long time, and there's no better resources I could think of than John and Adam for sharing with you what's going to come from this election looking forward for credit unions, both at the state level and outside the Beltway, or inside the Beltway, rather. Adam has been our lead lobbyist for the Association of Vermont Credit Unions for a long time now. Is a highly regarded lobbyist in his firm too, in the State House, and so we're real fortunate to have him on board with us and his staff. And John, I've known for even longer, a long, long time. And I don't know if we both go back the same number of years, and we won't start talking about numbers, but it's a long time anyway.
Everybody introduces me as having known me a long time now. I'm not certain I like that.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to go there. But John was a long time head of everything advocacy for the Credit Union National Association in Washington, D.C. Has since done a couple different things with NCUA and whatnot, but now is part of a firm at I guess, a Washington level, not too much different, not dissimilar from Adam's state version here. And so both bring a ton of credit union knowledge and experience and legislative experience with them. So thank you, gentlemen. I guess we'll just throw it to you and you can run with it.
Great. Well, thanks, Joe, and for our credit union friends. Sorry to not see you in person, but glad to be here with you and excited to be here with John. I'm in the position as host of a chat with John, and so we're really excited, John, to have you here. And I think I'll just start with a little bit of Vermont landscape high notes, and then we'll really shift over to me, kind of getting John to talk about Washington and the bigger picture. 2-minute briefing on the Vermont landscape. We just came out of the longest legislative session in history. Everyone knows it shifted from business as usual in March to pandemic focus. The legislature, Vermont's legislature, was the first in America to be able to jump up into Zoom-enabled democracy. They were able to continue along passing legislation and crafting it. It was exciting and hard to work with. It's different and it's a challenge, but the most important thing they were able to do between March and adjourning 2 weeks ago was get over $1 billion in federal relief money out the door into the Vermont economy and balance the state budget without new taxes or major cuts. The high note there is that, like a good family budget, the Vermont legislature and the governor had hundreds of millions of dollars in reserves on the bottom line, so they were able to balance this year's budget without a real big challenge. Noteworthy that broke through, and just 3 quick high points, one of which touches our industry. So everything became all about COVID starting in March, but there was also a few big issues that broke through. One was global warming, where you see a lot of activism, and a law got put in place. Despite the governor's objection, he vetoed it and was overridden. That creates a construct to drive Vermont to do more on climate change. The other, following the George Floyd incident, was Vermont, just yesterday, the governor let become law without his signature, something enacted by the legislature that is police power reforms, basically. And those details aren't ours or matter here, but it's interesting to see that issue broke through. And then the third is, after a decade of being around the legislature, the cannabis retail market law became law yesterday. Governor didn't sign it. He had some more work he wants them to do on it in January, but for the industry to know, and by 2022, we will see that marketplace start to open. There'll be a lot of change between now and then, and the financial institution issues will have to get sorted out more. As it relates to elections at the state level, we're in them now. The high note I would share with everyone is vote by mail is a big deal in America and in Vermont this year. The prediction is you're about to see that this is the beginning of the contrast between the Vermont briefing and John with national notes. Vermont's going to do vote by mail in probably have it go pretty well for us, and that will be different, interesting, and provocative, and maybe become the permanent policy going forward. But we're likely to see a contrast at the national level where it's a mess. But before talking about that, a few high notes on the election scene, just some predictions. Phil Scott is the most popular governor favorability rating in America, so his reelection looks pretty well assured. We're seeing change in the legislature with Tim Ash, who's the credit union championing, being out of the picture, and he was the president of the Senate. There's an incoming president of the Senate, a woman, Becca Ballant from Windham County, for our friends down there to know. She's a credit union champion, and Speaker Mitzi Johnson will be back if she doesn't get surprisingly beat in her own local race in the South Hero. And so we're looking at a pretty steady state for credit unions at the state legislative level. But John, let me just shift over to introducing you and just, piggyback a little bit on Joe. It's cool for me to be here with you today, and your resume is really pretty exciting, with being lobbyist in Washington. And President Obama put you on the NCUA, and you were the congressional liaison for that important regulatory body. And now you're in private practice and have a lot of insight. And so, shifting over to you, John, I guess I'd start off with a question for you at the very broad level, and work with me on the Zoom format so we can go back and forth a little bit. But
Sure.
At the broadest of levels, I would want the audience to know I'm planning to start off with the economy, move through the CARES Act, get into the elections. But John, you got a lot of insight. So what do you see ahead? What's hot right now? Just the economy, what's your highest note for the credit union community when we think about Washington or the big times right now?
Well, unfortunately, and I've known Joe and the league and a lot of Vermont credit union people over the years. And, the Washington that you guys used to come to when I would interact with you at the CUNA Government Affairs Conference and various meetings, and maybe when you came to NCUA, that Washington doesn't exist anymore. And it breaks my heart to say that, because this city has been dramatically affected in a negative way by the COVID-19 situation. I haven't been able to set foot on Capitol Hill since March. I've not been able to walk into the buildings, interact with staff, meet with members of Congress, et cetera. That has not happened since the shutdown occurred. I have seen a number of congressional staff off campus when we are able to find places to have a cup of coffee or a drink after work, but that's very difficult even. Last night I was at an event, a small event at the Hay Adams Hotel. Some of you may know where that is. It's literally right across the street from the White House, but it was just a different feel. So I'm starting off with a little bit of a down note, because the truth is that Washington and the way things are done here has changed. Now, I don't know if that's permanent or temporary. I hope it's temporary, but the need for advocacy, the kind of things you do in Montpelier and the kind of things I do here, that need has not changed, but just how we do it has changed. And I'm sure you've had the same experience. I do a lot of Zoom meetings with lawmakers and staff, and the need to get our message out, again, has not changed. But the methods, the tactics we use is different, and it will be for a little while longer. In terms of major issues, that's COVID is one. The overhang of the elections and the controversy that people feel like might be coming, that's also out there. Obviously, the economy's been affected. I had a conversation with one of the NCUA board members earlier this week, and we just talked about the effects of the uncertain economic situation on credit unions. And the board member said very candidly that they expect the worst to be yet to come. They think the worst is yet to come, especially in terms of perhaps delinquencies and loan problems with some of the lending. And I think that's going to have an effect on earnings. Now, of course, when this board member said that, I said, well, now I'm certain that the agency is going to work very hard to give credit unions some regulatory relief to help cope with that situation. And the board member's a little bit cagey about that, but I think that they are aware of the need for them to have a lot more flexibility during these times.
Got it. And it really, you touch on a couple of things there that I'd like to unpack and touch on a couple of them. And one of which is the economic times. And I guess starting there, do you have a sense of whether there's more relief coming? And I mean that at the broad congressional level. I candidly stopped following because there was great hope in the summer and fall as a state advocate that the federal government would create more flexibility around these CARES Act dollars. I mean, the Trump administration put them very narrowly out there. And the truth is, John, that we are state house insiders and represent the health industry, telecom. Like, we're pretty into the economy here, and it's hard to get those dollars out with those strings on them the way they are. It's use them or lose them. And
if we had had this call and this Zoom meeting on Monday, I would have been very optimistic about the chances for another COVID relief package. And then Tuesday afternoon, that fell apart. The president very abruptly pulled out of the discussions. Wednesday morning, they came back to life. Earlier today, they seemed to go off track again. So why don't we have this call again tomorrow, and I'll have a different report for you.
No, John, and I've come to understand, like, there's three types of federal aid. There's the money that state governments crave, which helps them with deficits that really didn't come. There's the type that goes out to businesses directly, like the PPP, which the credit unions saw a lot of action around that, I'm sure. And then there's the individual relief, which has been a lot of unemployment insurance and these stimulus checks. If we see any hope, I mean, the point of departure for me was you saying, hey, we're gonna have delinquencies. So when I hear that, I think of individual consumer level support and wanting that to get out there. What I've come to understand is Wall Street doesn't necessarily love that part. And so, do you have a sense of I guess this is where it depends on the election, right? In so many ways, but being a Washington insider, does the individual relief, is it popular down there, or is it just blue and red and it's really not clear where we're headed?
Well, I had conversations yesterday with congressional staff in both parties, and both of them talked about the popularity in theory of having checks go out to consumers, and how that seems to be in everybody's best interest, both parties and the president, to get money out the door to consumers to help them mitigate the economic problems. But again, it's and you laid it out pretty well there. You got a couple different types of aid. There's an awful lot of resistance on the part of the president, and I think on the part of the Republican Senate, to go along with the idea of giving aid directly to the states. They're very sympathetic to the consumer part, very sympathetic to the PPP part that you mentioned. The state and local aid, frankly, is a hang-up. And so that seems to be sort of a non-starter certainly with it. State and local just doesn't seem to be flying with the president. On the other hand, Speaker Pelosi is kind of insisting on it. Right. Conversely, the Republicans in the Senate and the president want the PPP refinements. They also want some kind of liability protection for businesses during this COVID time. And that seems to be a non-starter on the Democratic side. So we have a lot of difficulty in reconciling those two viewpoints. Congress, in my experience, Congress works in two time frames, now and not now. So we're seeing a situation where right now the talks appear to be at an impasse, but that could change. That really could. And when Congress wants to get something done, it can get done pretty quickly.
So totally understood. And I'm familiar with it's not happening and then it is. And what I've learned as a lobbyist is just be ready. Yeah. And so when it's not happening, just be in place, because when things pop, it happens quickly. Along those lines, I was looking at the American Bankers Association website just to kind of warm up for this time with you. And they were bemoaning that the credit union movement, who they say right on their homepage is very good at mobilizing Americans to stop proposals to tax credit unions. But also there was kind of be on guard, bankers. The credit union folks are hanging around these CARES Act bills trying to get member business lending caps adjusted and stuff like that. Do you think that the credit union movement is down in their position ready for stuff like this? Or for our credit union leaders, understood PPP is for our member business that's important, and the individual consumer level is important. But member business lending is something that some of us bump up against here, and so it's a hot topic. I know you guys hike the hill on this all the time, but is there a potential there's an opening and it pops, or is that just us keeping pressure on, or what's your sense around MBL?
I want to try to thread a needle with my answer. I've been advocating for member business lending relief really since HR 1151 passed, and there was a restriction put in it back in 1998, which is a long time ago. Congress, I think, in a rational world, Congress would of course be interested in helping credit unions do more with member business lending. I mean, right now we need that, right? The country needs it, the economy needs it, small businesses, everybody claims to love small businesses. And yet the bank lobby, I think, has continued to frustrate credit unions' attempts to get that cap lifted. It's almost comical to watch the bankers year in, year out testify against credit union member business lending, and they warn about the safety and soundness concerns as if they have something to lecture us about. I mean, 6 times more banks failed during the 2008-2009 crisis. I like to say that if there's one thing a banker knows what it looks like is a bad loan, because they clearly made a bunch of them. So I don't want to hear any lectures from the banking industry about credit unions taking undue risks. Specific to your question, I know the national trades, both NAFCU and CUNA, made an initial attempt to try to get Congress to look at member business lending relief a couple months ago. It didn't seem to get anywhere, candidly. And I spoke to some people in both the House Financial Services Committee and on the Senate Banking Committee, and they felt like it was too volatile of an issue to take up. I also, by the way, in addition to member business lending relief, I think credit unions should get some capital relief right now. I think this would be a time when Congress ought to look at making at least a temporary change in the Federal Credit Union Act to give credit unions some more flexibility on capital standards. But again, that doesn't seem to be happening either. This next COVID package appears to be pretty narrow.
Got it. Understood. That was a big signal from you, and you know best because we're all out here listening to CNN and Fox News, and it's really hard to tell. But if it happens, it'll be narrow.
Now, there is one issue. There's one issue that I want to emphasize that's specific to credit unions. That's a really positive issue, and that involves something very arcane called the Central Liquidity Facility, the CLF. That's something that is a very reasonable, prudent backstop that credit unions have to provide liquidity to the industry at times of stress. We used that back in 2008, 2009, when I was at NCUA. We used that with a great deal of success, and we just had the cap on that lifted back in the CARES Act. We're trying to get it, and that was lifted until December 31st. We're trying to get it lifted. That extended all the way to December 31st, 2021, because we don't know what the situation is going to be like next year. So keep your fingers crossed that Congress will listen to us and extend that CLF borrowing authority another year. I think it's prudent and reasonable. I like the belt and suspenders approach when it comes to that kind of thing. And it's good for credit unions to have that as a backstop.
Yeah, and good. I appreciate that, you won't be surprised as a lobbyist. I'm very familiar with tax and member business lending. And I'm mindful that the parts you were just talking about are very meaningful to the folks that work in the credit unions with the actual money and the actual members. I don't totally understand them, but thank goodness that you have your focus on things like capital and these other matters. Let me just take a little bit of a zoom out, and then we're going to come back to the elections and set up you talking about what I see as the 3 possible scenarios coming out of the federal election and try to understand what they mean for credit unions. But before we go there, I'm mindful as a lobbyist that, champions of our side are really significant. And there's usually a few key people, that understand and care about you. And in the Vermont legislature, that's the case with several key leaders. My question, John, is when we think about the elections, before we go broad and talk about the big landscape, is there anybody who's particularly a champion of the credit unions who you see out there that's at risk? I mean, the Democrat Republican balance can shift and not mean much or mean a lot, but a champion losing can be really drastic, or retiring even, you know.
Right. Well, that's a great question. I'm fortunate to say that not too many of the incumbents who are strong credit union friends are in serious danger. There's a congresswoman from Missouri who's on the House Financial Services Committee who appears to be in a neck-and-neck race. Senator Susan Collins from next door over in Maine, I think she's in a very difficult race, and she's been a good credit union friend. One of the little secrets about Congress is that most of the work is done on committees, on the key committees of jurisdiction. I'm sure it's the same way in your state legislature. And I would say that, you know, on the Senate Banking Committee and on the House Financial Services Committee, not a lot of our best friends are really in serious danger as far as I can see right now. I hope I'm not proven wrong, but I suspect, by the way, I think most of the incumbents who lose, at this point at least, looks like it's going to be on the Republican side. They look like they're in for getting the worst of it in this election. I say that a little hesitatingly because, you know, back in 2016, I was on a similar, I actually, believe it or not, spoke in person to a league about a week before the 2016 election. And they asked me to make a case how Donald Trump could win. And I just couldn't come up with one. And it was, you know, I was wrong about that. A lot of people were. I think it's very difficult. His political situation right now, in most ways, I think looks worse than it did in 2016. In 2016, he was a relatively unknown commodity, but he had a surge of popularity just because people wanted to try an outsider. I think he had an opponent in 2016 who was not particularly appealing, although at the time we didn't see that. I think former Vice President Biden is benefiting right now from not being Donald Trump in a lot of respects.
Right. Totally understood. And we're going to come, pen's flying, come to that a little bit more, but the converse part of the converse of the question are champions. Is there anybody who's particularly been a critic of the credit unions who's up for reelection, or could we see a change in the, you know, is there somebody who's well known as the banker's top person who just keeps grinding the saw at us?
Well, you know, fortunately we did, you know, I'll answer that by telling you when we had the big tax reform bill back in 2017, you know, I was constantly on the Hill and constantly vigilant, worried about somebody trying to get an amendment or a provision in a bill to tax credit unions. You know, the banks failed so miserably in that exercise. They didn't get a single member of either chamber, either party to even offer an amendment to tax credit unions. So if they had, I'd be able to say, well, that person's been an adversary.
Right.
They lost, we won. Okay.
Right.
And so it's hard, you know, sometimes some of these issues are very situational though. I mean, I think there are people, for instance, on the Democratic side who are very favorable toward us getting more ability to serve consumers. So that makes them credit union friends. Those same people, however, are frequently in favor of a more aggressive and assertive CFPB, which I want to get to in a couple minutes, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So they're not that friendly on that issue. So I think it's a situational thing. Those same Democrats, like I said, they're our best friends when it comes to credit union bank issues, not so much when it comes to regulatory burden. On the other hand, Republicans are all for us when it comes to reg burden and helping relieve us of regulatory requirements from CFPB. But when it comes to us versus the banks, sometimes they get a little bit hesitant. Those are generalities.
Yeah, no, and that's a great segue into this next segment, and then we'll you know, get to those points you wanted to talk about in a minute. But I think in our pre-meeting, we really identified 3 possible scenarios coming out of this election. Let me just identify them, and let's go through each of them and see, you know, some commentary from you on what it may or may not mean for the credit union movement and industry. One is Trump's reelected and the Senate stays Republican. So status quo, red there. Another is Biden wins, but the Senate stays Republican. And so we end up in a place where, you know, there's a lot of partisan wrangling between the White House and the Senate. And then third scenario, Biden wins, Senate becomes Democratic, and it's kind of a blue day, which, you know, the course of history has suggested in my recent lifetime that would last about 2 years before the midterms and something would change. But taking those three scenarios, setting aside the House, I get when I say all red, I'm really keying in on the White House and the Senate. And so red, blue, blue. And what does it mean for the credit unions in any order you think makes sense, or riff off of it the whole way? But you know, over to you for kind of, this is the big one, the big question.
Yeah, well, the next, you know, if the president is reelected, I think if he's reelected, the Senate is very likely to stay Republican. The House is probably going to stay Democratic, irrespective of what happens in these other areas. I mean, the Republicans will have to pick up, I think, 21 or 23 seats in the House. I don't see that happening right now. I think the Republicans could retain the Senate. You know, would likely retain the Senate if President Trump is reelected. And then you still have a Democratic House. So it's going to be kind of that would be a status quo scenario. A Biden presidency with a Democratic House and a closely divided Senate, to me, that feels like a real possibility. It also feels like a real possibility to see that blue wave you were just talking about, where you have a Biden-Harris presidency and you have both chambers in the Democratic camp. I think in that scenario, that third scenario, you're going to see probably a rollback of the tax reform of 2017, which could present some heartburn for us. We have to be, anytime that the tax code is on the table, we need to be extra watchful. I think in a blue scenario, one other thing I'd like to caution everybody about, and I'm not saying this from a partisan perspective, I'm not trying to appeal to the Democrats or Republicans in the audience today, but I think you're going to see a lot more activism out of the CFPB, the agency that I mentioned a couple minutes ago. Under Obama, you had this entity created. It had a very activist director under Obama. Trump has put in less activist people to head it up. But I would expect that if we do have a Democratic wave and a Democratic CFPB again, that's going to be an agency that we're going to be talking a lot about. And it's going to be, for better or for worse, much more aggressive. So that's one policy outcome I'd be willing to bet on if you get a Democratic administration.
Got it. And so if it stays status quo, meaning Trump administration and Republican Senate, the credit unions are unlikely to see more regulation, and the tax fight really isn't on the table.
Right, but I think it also, in that scenario, it's going to be hard for creditors to get any kind of meaningful additional help from Congress in terms of things like member business lending, because again, the Republicans may be more apt to listen to the banks in stopping us from doing those things to update our ability to serve. You know, I've always approached my work with credit unions in a bipartisan manner. And by the way, I wasn't appointed by President Obama to NCU.
Oh.
I was appointed by President George W. Bush, but the Obama people kept me on. So I actually have served both administrations, both parties. And again, the credit union issues lend themselves to a lot of bipartisanship. Where I'm going with that is simply to say that we, like I said earlier, we have a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle, and we may appeal to them for different reasons, but we still have real friends. And I think we can make it work no matter who is in charge. We're just going to have to fine tune the way we talk about our issues.
Right, Tony. So what I heard is it cuts different ways depending on who's in charge. It's going to cut one way. It's going to cut either way. You know, I mean,
right.
Which is to be expected. But they're different directions based on the outcome of the election, really. You know, one tends towards more relief for individuals but more regulation for us, and the other tends to be less relief for individuals, but likely less regulation for us.
Yeah, you have to talk about politics with Bernie Sanders in a different way than you have to talk about it, let's say, with somebody like Lindsey Graham or someone else like that. There's just it's the vocabulary we use in this business is very important.
Right. So can you just talk a little bit more about the rollback stuff? And I heard about some of that on the debate last night. As I'm just a fan of watching this stuff. And they were parsing each other's words, but if the Democrats take hold, what does get rolled back, or how does that? I mean, I get you can't predict, but you're a veteran and you have a sense of what kind of the center line may be.
Yeah, one of my favorite political philosophers is a guy named Yogi Berra. I think he also used to play baseball, but he used to say predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. And I think it's in this case predicting what's going to happen is difficult. But I would take, for instance, former Vice President Biden at his word when he says he wants to roll back a lot of the Trump tax cuts in the tax program. I believe that he does want to do that. And I think what they'll do is they'll probably try to look at the tax reform bill of 2017 and remake it along more along Democratic lines, meaning probably more relief for the lower income, more taxes on higher income. Who knows what the business tax code will look like. But again, that's a scenario where anytime they put the tax code on the table and open it up, the bankers are always going to be whispering in the ear of Congress to, if you want to find more revenue, tax these guys. And honestly, I'll tell you a scenario that has kept me up at night for years, and that is what happens if the banking industry decides to try to suggest to Congress, don't tax all credit unions, but just tax those big guys, and whatever the big guys is defined as. Some people think that the banks would try to tax credit unions of 100 billion in assets and above. Some people even think 500 million and above. Either way, I think it's going to be politically challenging for us to continue to make the case. I mean, I know that a large credit union and a small credit union are fundamentally the same animals. They have the same DNA, but the banks may try to say that a big credit union is somehow not deserving of its tax exemption anymore. And if they succeed in dividing the industry and maybe make credit unions not as willing to try to help the biggest of the big among us, and I would strongly argue that we are the same, whether it's a credit union of Navy Federal, which is close to 75 billion now, or down to the smallest credit unions that are out there. I think credit unions fundamentally are the same institutions. A consumer relates to a credit union in the same way, regardless of the asset size. And it's not about size, it's about structure. But I think the bankers could get some members of Congress to be more sympathetic to them if they try to divide us along assets. I also think we're going to have to watch the Community Reinvestment Act in a Democratic Congress and administration. I think there's a lot more sympathy on that side to putting credit unions under CRA. And I think there are good arguments why we shouldn't be, but that's an issue that I think will come up again in the next Congress.
It won't surprise me. It won't surprise me, John, because we've dealt with literally those two proposals periodically in the Vermont State Legislature. At one point they were considering, let's tier the banks, and of course in comes, well, let's do that to the credit unions too. And then the banks lobby, who has, what's that?
What sizes were they talking about tiering?
Joe, I'm not sure if Joe can remember, but I think, everything here is small. I'm not going to get the numbers right. They were definitely not the big numbers there. But what I remember thinking was that all of our major members, the major size members in Vermont were going to be caught up in it. And it served the bankers' intended purpose, which was to get us to show up and make the idea of taxing the big banks go away, right? And it was but the CRA piece we periodically deal with here as well, and it's a tough one to talk about, but understood in that regard. So that we're dealing with that locally even as you deal with that federally.
Yeah, I think we also need to be forceful on that issue and say, look, the banks earned themselves under CRA back in the 70s. They got CRA imposed on them because they were redlining communities and they were doing some very anti-consumer things. And you can't say that about us. And I'm very forthright in saying to members of Congress, we are the consumer's best friend. Credit unions do a better job of serving consumers than any other type of financial institution. And we need to shout that from the rooftops, because I think it's the case to impose CRA on credit unions will go away when Congress realizes all the things we do without being told to do them. We do them because they're the right thing to do.
Yeah. And locally, John, I've noticed just the Vermont credit unions have gotten better at talking about those good deeds. Because when we got in this fight 10 years ago, Joe and I came upon some frustration that, hey, our credit unions are doing good stuff, but they're just being too humble. They're not broadcasting it. It's not as clear. And, I'm glad to see that our credit unions are getting out more and more, articulating their good deeds. And of course, we know that the core argument is we're just returning more to consumers and we don't have the Wall Street payout. So, we've got our stock arguments.
I have a little secret along that line, and that is that in 33 years now that I've been advocating for credit unions on Capitol Hill in one form or fashion. And I can honestly say that in that 33-year period, I've never once told a lawmaker or staff person to pass a bill because it's good for credit unions. I've always said, pass a bill because this is good for our members.
Right.
We have to make that case every day that we're up there, because the reason Congress likes us is because they realize and they've been educated about the good things that credit unions do for consumers. There's an average of about 200,000 credit union members in every congressional district in the United States. That number gets people's attention, and the fact that we're the consumer's best friend also gets their attention. So Don't think about simply credit union versus bank. That's what the banks want. It's not about the brick and mortar institutions. It's about what we do for the consumers.
Totally understood. And that's why I love Project Zip Code. So all the credit unions that you participate, thank you, because Project Zip Code is horsepower for your people inside these buildings. It's really puts lawmakers straight up at attention when we can roll out those numbers. And so we're bigger and more real than they think. So sticking with the elections theme, John, Joe and AVCU and my team just finished getting some of our local PAC dollars out to key candidates a little later in the season, but our session ran long, and it's just kind of awkward to be making campaign contributions while lawmakers are in deliberation. So of course we're right on that. And thank you to the credit union Vermont leaders that support that PAC, because it makes a big deal, and good job, Joe and Mary, getting that out. But my question for you, John, to prompt is, it feels like a funny election season because of the pandemic, obviously, but how's the credit union movement doing with engagement? How's our PAC engagement at the federal level? What do you see as different about these elections? I get there's not a lot of rallies, but a lot of online, but just can you give a little bit of your perspective on the CU movement in the election scene? Are we carrying our weight? Are we engaged? What do you see that's different? Yeah.
It's so hard to tell this time. That's a great question without a good answer right now, because campaigning and politics, they already electioneering was changing because of social media and the way things were done. That's pre-COVID. Now that you have COVID, as you suggest, the retail politics are just very difficult. I'm not hearing any stories of candidates doing a lot of rallies. The knocking on doors is not happening. I suspect that the credit union, that our political efforts have changed with the times, as they should have, given what's going on with the pandemic. But, I do think we are, from what I can tell, from what I read, and I'm sure, of course, you read the same things, it sounds like credit unions are spending a lot of money, and I hope wisely, here for the candidates for federal office. But I think the perception of credit unions we've kind of a 1-2 punch. We have money, which is important in politics, always has been. I've always defended the PAC system, by the way, as something that is more above board. I mean, we had money in politics prior to the evolution of the PAC system in the 70s. We had that money. We had a lot of money. We just didn't know about it. Now you've got a more open, disclosed environment. But I also hope that the grassroots aspect of credit unions shows up. And I can tell you firsthand, I worked on Capitol Hill prior to joining CUNA, and I have a lot of friends on Capitol Hill. Time and time again, you hear lawmakers talk about how credit unions' ability to reach out to the grassroots and to talk about what a lawmaker does for credit unions, that's a really important thing that we can do. So I urge any and all credit unions, if you have something good to say about a lawmaker, make sure you tell your members. Candidates, lawmakers like to hear it when their work on our behalf is recognized. You don't have to say vote for Joe Smith. You don't have to say vote for Jane Jones, but you do have to say when the chips were on the table, Jane Jones stepped up for your credit unions and stepped up for our members. We've got a lot of work to do, but I think we're doing it.
Yeah. I am definitely seeing at the Vermont level a disruption in the traditional campaigning, but I'm also seeing an emergence, and this is going to slip away from the credit union focus, but and I mean this generically stated, but a lot of identity politics are coming in much bigger in Vermont in a way, and so there's less here's my track record and more here's my profile, vote for my profile, and that's different and new for us, and maybe we're just like the last people coming into that, but it's very, there's a phenomenon, there's great interest, John, in running for office here. We have packed primaries and a lot of enthusiasm. There's an organization called Emerge that is helping women get more into elected office, and it's really made a big difference over the last several years. We have a lot of female leaders in state politics at this point, and that's new and different. But still, the complexion of the elected leaders is changing, and I'm just curious if you see any changes at the federal level, or it's just different up there where it's less connected to the local communities, the type of people that are running, or what's motivating them, or how they're showing up.
Well, I certainly see a lot more diversity in candidates now. Congress has become a lot less white, a lot less male, and I think in the next Congress, it's going to be even more pronounced. The number of female and minority candidates is going to be impressive. And I think they come from all over the spectrum. And I think they inject a lot of new perspectives and a lot of new energies. I'll put a plug in for something that I've been on for years, and that is I wish more credit union people would step forward and run for office. Mm-hmm. The banks, candidly, have more bankers who choose to throw their hats in the ring. And I think it's such a natural for credit unions. I wish we'd see this more often. There have been a few over the years, but not many.
Yeah. We see that in the Vermont level, for sure. Bankers in office or being around. And so I second that plug. I love it when, for example, John, we work with the renewable energy industry, and all of a sudden there's like 4 or 5 House lawmakers who are there on, taking leave from their job working in the solar industry. And it's just really interesting to see how, but that's an issue, right? That's got a lot of passion around it. Climate change. I'm in this job because it's a passion for me. And I like credit union people with passion, and I second that plug. All right, I'm mindful of the time, and we're kind of shifting to the closing segment here. We've talked about the credit unions in the elections. We've talked about the big congressional shifts or Washington shifts that may or may not happen. I just want to take one more pass through the regulatory landscape, and I mean at the regulatory agency, because you're uniquely got insight into all that. And is there anything you want to call out kind of coming ahead
Well, that's a great, yeah, that's a very important topic. NCUA right now, 3 members on the board, one of whom is serving in a holdover capacity. His term, Mark McWaters, was the chairman, appointed by, he was actually appointed by President Obama. He's a Republican who was appointed by Obama and became chairman under the Trump administration, but he was replaced as chairman by Rodney Hood. But Mr. McWaters is still on the board, even though his term has expired. His successor has been nominated, a gentleman named Kyle Hauptman, who actually works for a member of the U.S. Senate from Arkansas, but he's from Maine, right next door to you. Well, not right next door, 2 states over.
John, just let me interrupt for a second and say, John, many of us feel like it's right next door because a surprising number of us vacation in Maine. It's
imagine that. Gorgeous, 2 gorgeous states, Maine and Vermont, but New Hampshire gets in the way sometimes, I know. But nonetheless, Kyle Hauptman has been nominated. He's been voted on and approved by the Senate Banking Committee on a party line vote. He has not been confirmed by the full Senate. And the Ruth Bader Ginsburg situation with the Supreme Court and all the acrobatics that are going on around that, I think that has put Mr. Hauptman's nomination on hold. Now, I don't know whether that's going to, I'm not trying to convey that means he's in trouble. I just think they're not going to get to him for a while. And if they don't vote to confirm him by December 31st, his nomination goes away. So, yeah, so the Republican Senate, especially if the president loses, I think the Republican Senate is going to try very hard to vote to confirm him and get him on the NCUA board, because that'll be a way for a Trump appointee to get into the administration and continue serving. His term won't end until 2025.
Interesting.
If Trump does lose and Biden wins, you're going to have a new chairman, I think. Todd Harper, who is currently serving as the Democratic member, I think he's going to be named chairman. Even if he has 2 Republicans he's serving with, he'll be a minority chairman, which could be a very tricky situation, I think.
That's the stuff of insiders. One quick plug for folks. If you use the chat box, if you have any questions you'd like John to answer or me to talk about at the Vermont level, Joe just kind of popped it up, but no, there's a chat box. You can pull it up in Zoom and it'll spring up for us to see. And, for my part, just to go back to Vermont for a moment, and when we think about these elections, the thing I would want to signal to everybody, and then it's going to be back over to you, John, is, I talked about the vote by mail at the beginning, and this is a big American moment, this voting by mail election. And it's our sense it's going to go well here in Vermont, and there won't be a post-election uncertainty period. There might be a few days, but John, what I'm picking up on, not setting aside the president's, comments on the issue, which I know he would say are meant to be provocative. Do you have a sense of, the potential for the post-election uncertainty? I mean, as a law student, I would worry about this moment, America in crisis. I mean, how could this be bad? What would this mean for credit unions, if anything? But can you just talk for a minute about, it's November 15th and we have a 4-4 Supreme Court, it can just get really pretty troubling pretty quick.
It's troubling. Yeah, troubling is a good word for it. I worry about it. I mean, I was working in DC for CUNA in 2000 when there was uncertainty following the Bush-Gore election. I don't have much of a stomach for turmoil, honestly. I mean, our country, I think the internet has made us much more polarized. I think social media, it's a lot of, there's a lot of anger and toxicity out there. And like I said, I don't have much of a stomach for it. I hope that the election is not that uncertain. I do know that there were examples in primaries this year. This is not the norm, but it was some places New York, New York City had a couple primaries that took 8 weeks to decide because of some of the uncounted mail-in ballots. There were some problems in some Pennsylvania primaries. That doesn't mean that was the case across the country. Fortunately, I think we have a pretty stable, well-run electoral system. But I guess based on what your question is, and based on what I've heard from some pundits in both parties, there's a possibility that we could have a contested election. And let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's hope whatever the outcome, whoever you're for, let's hope that there's a nice, clean verdict where we can get back to getting back to being being one country and move on for some of the issues we have to tackle. I think electoral unrest is the last thing we need, I hope.
Got it. Understood. And so I feel like I've covered, the prepared comments. John, is there anything that I've left off, or Joe, that you want to suggest we talk on? I mean, I'm going to end with the contrast. Vermont, bipartisan, stable, vote by mail, smooth transition to power, not a big change election. I mean, it's a big change election for the Vermont electorate, but that energy is going towards Washington. So for Vermont credit union leaders, we think it's going to feel at the state government level a lot like it does today. And John, it's just crystal ball for you, I guess, is the.
You've covered the waterfront quite well. I mean, there's legislative and regulatory issues are going to be determined by what happens in 3.5 weeks. And, we'll know our marching orders when the electorate speaks November 6th. I just am looking forward to it. I'm excited by it. I think credit unions have a lot of, we're good at this. We have a lot of expertise in the credit union movement. In addition to credit union people being good at running their financial institutions, they're also very good at advocacy and very good at telling our story. So I just would implore you to keep doing what you're doing, regardless of who's in control in Washington. We definitely need more, less.
So I have a question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, John.
I have a question for both.
No.
I have a question for both of you that kind of crosses Vermont and DC a little bit, and that's that we haven't heard about him in the news for a while because the focus has been on the presidential candidates and the virus and all of that. But it's a little bit of a naive question, but what do you think happens to Bernie Sanders after this next election? What's it? I mean, he built up this machine and whatnot, and ran for candidacy twice and everything. What happens after this?
I think he's got a tremendous amount of influence within the Democratic Party. I would almost say that even though Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, and I think in a lot of ways Bernie Sanders may have won the primary in the sense that this is becoming more of a Bernie Sanders party than a lot of people thought it would become. And, candidate Biden and Sanders co-authored a position paper back in early September that laid out a lot of the themes for the Biden administration. And that had a tremendous amount of Bernie's fingerprints on it. I mean, I think he has become a very influential leader within the Democratic Party, even if he did not win the nomination. So, I would look to him as somebody who could have a tremendous amount of influence. And a lot of the people who he has inspired have begun to run for office and have started getting nominations. AOC over in New York City is almost daily talks about something that Senator Sanders has done to inspire her. So he is a very influential player in the Democratic Party, I think.
Yeah, and I'll pick up to say I think Senator Sanders will keep going, and be a Vermont senator and for a while. For us at the local level, Senator Leahy's seat will come up first, and he may be the more likely of the two to retire, and we'll see a lot of interest in those three seats in the next several years. In particular, anticipate Vermont is the only state that has not sent a woman to Congress. So there's going to be great momentum for a female candidate for that seat that opens up if it's Welch moves up or Leahy's seat is open. So just, heads up in that regard. But as it relates to Bernie Sanders, the machine will keep rolling, at the local level.
So I asked that question because I know, he built up quite a constituent machine and whatnot, and a lot of his desires were in the Democratic platform and all of that. But I just wondered if he continues to be an integral part of the Democratic Party going forward, or does he kind of like steer off a little bit, because he's got this momentum behind him of this different sector of Democrats or whatnot.
I look at him as it just, again, as a function of energy. And he's a lot of the energy in the Democratic Party is coming from his wing of the party. So, I think he recognizes this as his moment. I think he's got a real chance to have a lot of influence in the next Democratic administration.
And it's not going anywhere, but I think I apprised people in Vermont anyway, was it last week or the week before, that Bernie co-authored some legislation, thankfully not going anywhere, but for postal banking.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's the second or third time that comes up, and it's not going anywhere in this Congress, but it is something to watch out for, depending on who gets elected in the next.
Agree, completely.
Yeah.
A question from the chat box for me to just touch on dropping some names of emerging female leaders and that would be eyeing those Washington seats. These won't be household names to most of you, but coming out of this, it's likely to be a group of women coming out of the state capitol. Out of Chittenden County, a new incoming Senator, Keisha Ram, is very ambitious. Windham County State Senator Becca Ballant also talked about for Washington. Also, obviously, Molly Gray, the Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor, she's openly hoping to go lieutenant governor, bounce to Washington. She does not seem very interested in Vermont state politics or Vermont state issues. And so those three, some of you may remember from your business work, Pat Moulton strikes me as, or Pat Powden. It strikes me as somebody who, Pat Moulton, somebody that might kind of emerge as out of nowhere and be a candidate for Washington. So there's a lot of ambition. The speaker, Mitzi Johnson, would be another name to throw out there for sure.
Molly Gray, been on the airwaves a lot during this campaign and whatnot. She was a little bit of a surprise, wasn't she, in her bid for lieutenant governor?
She really was. Yeah. Someone who has not been on the radar screen at all. And, it's the power of the circle of players around Pat Leahy. She's really tight with them and they got her started and she's been meteoric. Great
at the
television
time,
ads
I remember that a lot of us thinking that the pro tem of the Senate, Tim Ash, was on track to be lieutenant governor just because he was the most household worthy name.
He ran on ideas and she ran on bio and it worked.
Interesting. Well, it is different times for sure. Thank you, gentlemen, for spending your last part of your afternoon with us. It's been insightful and great. We really appreciate it. You both have a unique perspective, both from Montpelier and from Washington, and it's been very helpful to all of us. And all eyes will be on, 3 weeks now, about 3 weeks, or 3 weeks in a day or something like that till the elections. So we'll see.
Thank you.
See what happens.
Thank you. I miss being with you in person. I was looking forward to that, but maybe next year.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Adam. And thanks to everybody for watching us this afternoon, whether it was for just a portion of it, just a segment, or the whole thing. We greatly appreciate it. We'll have recordings of everything that we did today uploaded to our YouTube channel at some point in the near future. And have a good rest of your evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.